My brother's name is Donald. Never Don, never Donnie, always Donald. When I was about 12 and he was 8, he was playing Little League and we were at the baseball field and he was in the outfield doing as many 8-year-olds in the outfield would be doing. And his coach was trying to get his attention and he kept yelling, "Hey, Don! Hey, Don!" Finally, the coach was exasperated and turned and looked at my mother and said, "Your son is not listening." And she said, "Well, if you call him his name, Donald, he probably will listen." He had this look of sort of, wow, this mom has some nerve, but humored her and turned around and said, "Hey, Donald," to which he promptly said yes. There's so much in a name. When you have the wrong name, in the case of my brother, it meant he just didn't listen. With the case of the story, it shapes our entire hearing of the story. Our parable, our story today, is almost always given the name, the workers in the vineyard, or the laborers in the vineyard. And this sets us up with a whole presupposed understanding about what this story is all about. It's about the workers. That influences our hearing of this story. It influences us so that we usually hear this story in a way that is about God as the landowner and we as the workers. And when God is the landowner and we are the workers, God's justice is abundant. But what if this story has a different name? As suggested by the Rabbi Amy Jill Levine, what if it had the name Complaining Day Laborers? Or Surprising Salaries? Or The Humane Capitalist? Or The Conscientious Boss? Or Last Hired, First Paid? Or Debating a Fair Wage? Now, all of those are sort of fair titles, really. But do you notice how the shift of the title, the shift of the name, shapes what we might hear in the story? Similarly, I think we can try to identify and put our minds with different characters in the story. What if you side with the first hired? What if you side with the last hired? Or what if you side with the landowner? What then?
Ohio at Huntington Park. We're intercepting folks on their way to the beach to ask them some questions on fairness regarding a scenario that played out in a neighborhood nearby. There is a homeowner in town with a very large property, and he has some landscaping that needs to be done. So he goes out into the neighborhood and finds a teenage boy there and asks him if he would work in his yard. And he offers to pay the teenage boy $75 to work from 9 to 5. The neighborhood boy agrees to that rate of pay and shows up the next day for work. At noon, the homeowner goes back into the neighborhood and finds another teenage boy and asks him if he'll join the first one and work in his yard. And the homeowner offers to pay the boy a fair rate. The boy agrees. At 3 o'clock, the homeowner goes back into the neighborhood again, finds yet another teenage boy, and asks him to join the other two in his yard. The boy agrees. At 4 o'clock, the homeowner makes a final trip into the neighborhood, hires another teenage boy to work in the yard. And so now he's got 4 boys working in his yard. At 5 o'clock, he calls an end to the day and draws the boys together to begin paying them. And he starts paying the one hired last first. What do you think he pays the boy who was hired at 4 o'clock?
Hopefully, like $50. But, like, maybe he did that if he was shady. I'm not sure.
I would have done the economical answer and said I would have valued them by the hour and paid them all by the hour.
The fact is, the owner gathered them all together and paid every boy $75. The one that was hired for the last hour and the one that started at 9 o'clock. What do you think of that?
I would be a little upset if I was the first guy who had been there for 4 or 5 hours.
Definitely. I would be too. Yeah, because you worked harder and did a lot more work. I think the kids that got hired first should get paid a little more than the kids that got hired last.
The first boy, if he worked longer all day, and then the other boy just worked an hour, it's not really fair.
Did he have an agreement with the rest of them? I don't know. But no, it's not fair, I don't think. I don't think so. I think the first kid got a bad shake.
What do you think the boy who was hired last thought?
It's a great deal. He has score, that's awesome. But the first boy probably was pretty mad. I would be mad.
What if you were the boy hired at 4? What would you have thought?
I got quite a deal.
How about you?
I agree.
Okay.
$75 an hour, that's more than I ever made when I was working.
Like for an hour's worth of work, you should probably get like $7.50 minimum wage. Maybe a little bit more since it's under the table and there's no taxes.
What do you think about the homeowner?
Unfair.
Yeah.
I don't know why he'd do that.
He doesn't really know what he's doing. He shouldn't have paid the last guy for like a whole day's of work for only an hour.
In actuality, the homeowner's the one that was unfair because he was taking advantage of the people. And the boy that worked from 8 until 5 and earned $75, if he'd known what was going on, he'd have left at noon.
It depends on what he offered each kid at each time frame as to whether or not it was fair or not. I'd feel sorry for the kid that started work that morning if he offered him $75, but he agreed to it. So you get paid what you agree to work.
I think he's a pretty generous guy.
Yeah.
I think I'd want to work for him.
We can so easily identify with each of the characters in this story. Likely, when we think about that first hired, we get annoyed that the last hired got the same amount of pay as we did. We worked longer. We worked harder than that other one, and it's just not fair. Likely, when we think about the last hired, we think, woohoo, fantastic. I mean, maybe, we don't know the story, maybe we'd worked an entire day's work someplace else and got this extra bonus job because we're still trying to make ends meet, and woohoo, we got a full day's rate again. Or maybe we took care of our kids all morning because we couldn't find childcare, and we got home and we're able to find a little bit of time to work, and we got a whole day's wage. Again, woohoo, fantastic. Or maybe we were lazy all day long. And then we decided, well, maybe we should be productive. So we got out there and we got a little bit of work, expecting a little bit of pay, but bonus, got a full day's work. So whatever happened, that last person had cause to celebrate. But if we think about that landowner, wow, that person was either very foolish or was super generous. And we don't really know what the story was for that landowner, what was going on for them. Maybe there wasn't enough workers the first time around when they went out, and they had to keep going back for more and more. Maybe there was more work than anticipated, and they kept having to go back out and find somebody else to work. But every time the landowner went back out there was apparently more workers, more good workers, because it doesn't say that there was like leftover bad workers left. It was good workers sitting idle, waiting for work. So whatever the reason, at the end of the day, that landowner pays them all the agreed upon wage, no matter how long they had worked. And that was enough to feed a family of that time for about 3 days. So not an exorbitant amount of money, but enough. What a difference perspective can make on this story. Now, if you've been in worship for the last couple weeks, we've been talking about stories, and each and every week I've challenged us that we can read into these stories a whole bunch of stuff that's maybe there, maybe not there. But when we let this story just speak for itself, there is so much richness. Now, with this story, usually this is talked about as an analogy for the kingdom of heaven, as something for afterlife, as something that happens after we have died. The last are first, and the first are last. But what if this story that Jesus is telling has nothing to do with afterlife? What does Jesus' message mean for us then? As the Rabbi Amy Jill Levine says, if we refocus the parable away from who gets into heaven and toward who gets a day's wage, we can find a message that challenges rather than promotes complacency. This is one of those stories where it fits the saying that church should comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfortable. So if for whatever reason you are without work and you get hired at the last minute but you earn a full wage, what comfort that would bring. And if you work a full day and you get the same amount as someone who works a short time, perhaps afflicting our comfort is what we need to do. And if you're a wealthy landowner, aka someone who has enough and then some, to hear that generosity is what should be employed, generosity beyond what we term fair, that afflicts our comfortable sense of what ought to be. So this is a story, when taken as a story about the now and the here, not the then and the there, makes me squirm. Maybe it makes you a little uncomfortable too. Because I think Jesus tells this story to make us squirm. Jesus would have been very familiar with this scripture passage from Deuteronomy chapter 5, verse 15, which I was not familiar with. Since there will never cease to be someone in need on earth, I therefore command you, open your hand to the poor and needy in your land. Jesus makes clearly the case that, as Amy Jill Levine puts it, the rich who fail to open their hand will receive eschatological, that's big fancy church language for afterlife, punishment. Enter the squirming. So what do we do with these stories that we sort of think might be warm, fuzzy stories about God taking us all in the afterlife? And they don't leave us feeling so warm and fuzzy when we think about them and what they actually mean for us in our day-to-day life. Now, we can pretend that this only has to do with afterlife, and this only has to do with something outside of our control, and it only has to do with God being a landowner kind of person and being just beyond measure. We can continue to do that. That's good. But maybe, just maybe, Jesus is telling this story about how we are to be. About how we are to be in relationship with our neighbors. About how we are to be in community. And I think that squirming is the appropriate response. And I think it's okay if we just let it sit with that squirming for a while. We don't need to make ourselves feel better immediately. But what we do need to do is to allow that uncomfortable sense to work its way into us so that we might sense how God is calling us to respond. To not run away from the squirming, to not try to pretty it up and make ourselves feel better by the time we finish this sermon, but allow it to work in us. Because God works in our squirming. God works to help us bring justice. God works in us to help us bring fairness, here and now. Jesus tells a story. Not a pretty, comfortable, warm, fuzzy bedtime story, but a squirm-inducing story, if we let it. Amen.